everything?
Yeah, hello. Yeah, it's fine.
Hello, hello.
Hello, hello. Is that
Everybody
fine? Can everybody hear?
Good. Okay.
Fine. Okay.
So you don't have any notes, but you need to put the lights down pretty far since you don't have any
Yeah,
notes.
yeah, that's fine. Whatever it's best. pointer, that one. No, that's change, move the slide.
Oh.
Pointer?
Is it a red?
Oh, okay.
Very faint, isn't it?
There's other things to do with it. Okay. Sorry about that. Wait. 50% of my shore is dead.
I start talking, Phyllis will probably freak out. She'll think I'm starting. So I just have some announcements I want to make. Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome. I just have a few announcements. For the presentation, we are recording, so please silence your cell phones. I'd greatly appreciate that. For Zoomers, please stay muted. If you have a question or a problem, if you make a chat, make it to the host, to me. And I have someone that's monitoring that. So, but don't make it to the group on chat because it's going to show up in the middle of this presentation on the screen, and I don't like that. If you have problems with hearing, if you need the sound turned up, you can go into your audio in your Zoom on the bottom left side and go into your audio settings in your Zoom and turn it up. I will control it in the room here the best we can, but for you Zoomers, sometimes you have problems with the hearing, and I want to help you guys. People have been told me the headphones or ear pods are really good too if you struggle with the hearing on the ILR. But if you have questions at the end, we can put them in the chat and I will ask the speaker for the questions. Okay, so we're about ready to get started. Everybody get in a seat. Well, Phyllis is going to be our facilitator today and she'll introduce our speaker.
Thank you, Pam, and thank you all for attending both our Zoom audience and many people in the room. Very pleased to see you for a program on entomology that was originally titled Yucky or Yummy? Can we learn to love bugs? So you might have noticed the artwork that was included in the ILR bulletin, that somebody put that cockroach up there at the top. I had him down at the bottom, sorry. And you know, for those of you who may have attended the paleontology courses that I've developed here, every time that I think of a trilobite, I think that has to be the great-great-grandfather of cockroaches. It's got to be. Anyway, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Keith Willmott this afternoon, who will tell us about the evolution of insects and their role in the Earth's unique biosphere. Keith is a curator of Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths. But he's going to talk about the world of insects and their role in the Earth's unique biosphere. He is a curator of Lepidoptera at the McGuire Center for Lepidoptera and Biodiversity at the Florida Museum. And as a curator, he conducts research on the classification, evolution, and conservation of tropical American butterflies. As a curator, he also helps to oversee the growth and management of one of the world's largest Lepidoptera collections, working with staff, students, and volunteers to organize the collection and make it accessible for research. After taking his undergraduate studies at Cambridge University in the UK, Keith began his Ph.D. in entomology at the University of Florida in 1994, and after a brief postdoc in the UK, he returned to Florida in 2004 to take up his current position. So thank you for being willing to talk to our group, Dr. Willmott, and we look forward to your comments. Yep, it should be on. You're good. Got your thing.
Okay. Thank you very much. Can you hear that? Thank you very much, Phyllis. And thank you very much, everybody, for being here today. It's a great honor to be invited to give this first talk of this program, Friends or Foes, Can We Learn to Love Bugs? And as Phyllis mentioned, the title of my talk, Insect Evolution and Their Role in Earth's Biosphere, seems to be a dauntingly broad one. So I'm going to be very selective in what I choose to talk about. And I'm going to say right now that I'm going to be illustrating it in many areas rather shamelessly with examples from butterflies, which are really the group of insects that I know much better than many others. But let's see how we get on. So, of course, I wasn't always interested in insects like many people. And in fact, I came to it relatively late in the day. Here I am, aged about 6 in Kuwait, in the Middle East, where I lived for about 4 years with my family. It's my sister on the right, and had many memorable encounters with insects in those days, which I regarded with a lot less enthusiasm than I do now, particularly remembering the first day I learned that cockroaches could fly. One of my very fond memories of those times back there was a book that we had that was written by an expatriate, Keith Wells, entitled Whizzer, which described his adventures traveling around Kuwait with a rather maniacal driver by the name of Whizzer. But also one of the stories in that book was this one, which focused on the night that he was awakened by his wife to deal with a cockroach in their room, fully 70 millimeters long, as he described it, and obviously chaos ensued with various adventures involving bug spray and neighbors peering in and wondering what on earth's going on. But it was the final climax of this story that really stuck in my memory ever since, as our hero steps backwards and treads on the cockroach. And this phrase, "the slime of innards squeamed between my toes," has remained fixed in my memory ever since for the last 50 years or so. But of course, had this actually occurred in real life, there's a good chance that the cockroach would just merrily have bounced up and scuttled off. So this is a paper a few years ago focused on the American cockroach and showing how it's really incredibly durable creature that's capable of compressing its body to a third of its natural height and fitting through tiny spaces, enduring weights that are some 300 times its own body weight. And I just wanted to... So the authors of this paper were so inspired by observing these adaptations in the cockroach that they created their own version of a cockroach in the form of a robot that was capable of withstanding these sort of high pressures and compressing its body and crawling into very tight spaces, and suggested that this might be something which we could build upon and use, for example, in sending in robots to explore collapsed buildings and look for survivors. And so, inspired by the design of this remarkable creature. And of course, the cockroaches that we encounter on a day-to-day basis around our houses are only relatively few of all the species that are found in North America, a tiny fraction that actually bother us on a daily basis. And aside from being inspirational, for example, for designing new robots, there's so much that we can still learn about in the fields of biology by studying cockroaches in there. Yes, so even these cockroaches that bother us on a day-to-day basis have much to teach us. And when we look at cockroaches out in the in natural systems, that we find really extraordinary things, such as this remarkably beautiful cockroach from the Philippines, evidently potentially mimicking a toxic beetle. Whether the cockroach is also protected as well, we don't really know. There are thousands of species, many of them that are still formally undescribed, remain to have their biology investigated. This one on the left is one that always reminds me of a samurai warrior. These are very common cockroaches we find in our traps in South America when we're studying butterflies, but I know nothing about this, and I imagine its biology is still very poorly understood. Here's another example of a very interesting group of cockroaches found in the northern temperate regions of the world, Cryptocercus. It's the only representative of the family. And these cockroaches are flightless, and they live inside rotting logs. They pair up for up to a year or so before they begin to reproduce. And the nymphs take up to 6 years to develop and are cared for by the adults who feed them liquids from their anus, which contain microbes which they need to be able to digest the wood. And so what's interesting about this group of cockroaches, we now know that these are the closest closest living relatives of another major group of insects, which are often thought of as pests, which are the termites. And so these are in fact just highly developed cockroaches that are able to digest cellulose and break down the plant material that is indigestible for many other groups of organisms. So again, of the species of termites that are actually harmful or pest species, these are extremely few out of the several thousand species of termites in the world. Again, many species that are undescribed and poorly studied. And so, again, termites have many fascinating things to teach us. They are one of the groups of social insects with these remarkable different castes, these morphologically distinct groups that perform quite different functions within the colonies, within the nests, the workers that do most of the work, caring for the young and repairing the nests, and soldiers that are obviously defending the colony who are sterile and dependent on the other members of the colony, and then these winged reproductives which leave the colonies to found new colonies. And research is kind of still ongoing in understanding how these different castes are determined and decided upon and formed in a developmental way. And so a huge amount to learn there. And obviously termites, another feature of termites are these remarkable structures that they build, which not only serve to protect the colony, but also to store food reserves and to provide an internal microclimate, which is quite different from the external environment, which in many areas can be highly seasonal and a harsh environment for other species to survive. And so termites have learned to overcome the challenges of living in these environments by building these remarkable structures. In some cases, they even cultivate fungi within these mounds that help them to break down particularly indigestible plant material, and in return, the termites provide perfect growing environment for the fungi and an inexhaustible supply of plant matter. So really many fascinating stories to be learned from another group which we typically consider to be a pest. Silverfish is another group of insects that we regularly encounter around our homes that can cause damage due to their fondness for carbohydrates, eating many of the things that we keep about our houses. But again, a group that's not quite so diverse as those two previous groups, but that still has much to be discovered about them. I found this fascinating paper describing 2 new species of silverfish from this incredibly remote region in West Australia. Not only are these 2 species found in this area that's really in the middle of nowhere, but they are found deep within these isolated iron-rich rock formations and deep underground. And so these species were recorded for the first time by people lowering traps down boreholes in these rocks up to 20 meters or 60 feet down and leaving them for a couple of months, and then collecting these creatures that evidently live deep underground, really in the middle of nowhere. So to me, that's just quite an awe-inspiring story, that there are these organisms living so far away from anywhere we would consider to be inhabitable. So across the whole tree of life of insects, this is an evolutionary tree on the left, which shows the relationships among all the groups of insects. Somebody waiting for Google? We can see that these are groups of insects that are typically considered to be pests or pests from the perspective of humans. As you can see, they're scattered throughout the tree. And as we just saw in the first couple of groups I talked about, really the species that are problematic from our point of view are very few, and just a tiny fraction of the total species diversity, even among these groups that we consider to be pests. And I think you're going to hear more about some of these other groups in later talks, so we're not going to talk about those. So after that little diversion, for the rest of the talk, I'm going to talk briefly about what we mean by insects. What is an insect? I'm going to talk about the subject of insect diversity, which is obviously something that many of us think about when we think of insects, this fantastic number of species. A little bit about the evolutionary history of insects, some of the beneficial things that insects provide for us, a little bit about some of the kind of interactions between insects and the ecosystems in which they live, and what that can teach us in terms of understanding of evolutionary biology. And then finally, how insects can be important in education and in our own enjoyment of the natural world. So what are insects? Well, they're obviously members of the arthropods. They have segmented bodies, they have jointed legs, they have an exoskeleton, but they differ from other arthropods in having only 6 legs. So when we think about other arthropods such as spiders, scorpions, millipedes, crustaceans, we can readily recognize the insects as having only 6 legs, and differing from a couple of other groups that are within this group, hexapods, but are not typically considered insects by having the mouth parts not retracted into their head capsule. So these are other groups of 6-legged arthropods that are not considered to be insects because they have their mouth parts retracted. And so these are but essentially if you encounter a 6-legged arthropod, it's going to be an insect. And so what makes this group so fantastically diverse is one of the kind of questions that motivates the research of entomologists. So if we look at contributions of insect species and other organisms to overall biodiversity, we can see that arthropods are here in blue. Insects are the dominant group of arthropods, and together with the vascular plants, which are very closely interlinked with insects, as we'll see later on in the talk, these constitute about 75% of all of the living organisms on Earth. So insects more than half of that. So they really are a tremendously important group from the point of view of organismal diversity. So how many species of insects? So that's the overall diversity of insects, but another incredible feature of insects is how many species you can find just in one place. So one study in a site in Costa Rica found 437 species of ants just in 1,500 hectares, compared to only about twice that number in the whole of North America. And one of these typical features of insects is rarity. So 50 of those species are represented only by a single individual, and obviously learning more about those species is a constant challenge. The same is true of butterflies, for example. This is an area in eastern Ecuador where I've done a lot of research over the years. We recorded nearly 1,500 species just in that small area, compared to, say, 700 species in the whole of North America. So these are 1,500 species that interact together within a single community within this rainforest area, and nearly 500 of those only known from one particular place within that area because of their very specific habitat requirements. And so again, trying to understand the biology of these organisms and how they interact is a huge challenge. So within the insects, another important thing to note is that the majority of insects are contained within these 4 major groups here: the Lepidoptera, or the moths and butterflies; the Diptera, or flies; Hymenoptera, which are ants and wasps and bees, and the Coleoptera or beetles over here. And so these four major groups are also make up the majority of a group known as the holometabula, which are the holometabolous insects that undergo a complete metamorphosis with an egg, a larval stage, a pupal stage, and an adult. And I think you also have a talk more about this later on in the program. But as you can see, our understanding of actual numbers of insects is extremely vague. So estimates of the numbers of described species, that are species that have already been given a scientific name, vary from 750,000 to nearly 1.5 million. And so to many people who are not involved in the process of scientific classification, that seems highly mysterious. How can we not know how many species of insects have even been named? And so I just thought I'd give a little bit of a digression on that from my perspective as a taxonomist. So all organisms are described and named in publications, which can be often extremely obscure. This is a butterfly species that was described in 1775 in a very limited entomological journal that's probably only present in about 2 libraries in the world. And this is a description up here. It's very simple. It's partly in almost unintelligible German and partly in Latin. And this just says it's a butterfly with dark wings, a yellow band on this forewing and a white band on the hind wing. And that's it. And unfortunately, this butterfly was illustrated, so we have some vague idea as to what it is. But this was such an obscure publication that the same butterfly was redescribed at least 3 other times by subsequent people who were unaware of this description. And then if we look at the actual diversity in this group, these are 12 species in that same genus. Clearly that description could apply to almost any of them. And so with this, with this kind of historical aspect, it's often very difficult to know whether a species has been described before or not. And for most groups, there really is there's no list of all the names that have been published, and it's extremely difficult to know what those names actually represent. On the right-hand side is a species, actually a single species of heliconius butterfly. These are different geographic races, this one on the top and this one on the bottom, and this is a hybrid between them. And the hybrids between them can occur in multiple different forms. And so this genus, which actually only has about 40 species, has more than 1,000 names described for all of its different forms. And so both of these are reasons why even trying to determine how many species the existing names represent can be a challenge. But certainly in more recent years, we've come to know that even were we to understand how many species actually have names, that still doesn't tell us the whole story as to how many species there actually are. This butterfly here, Straptes fulgurata, is a very common species throughout the neotropics. In 2004, a paper was published that figured 10 quite different kinds of caterpillars feeding on 10 different plants that had quite significantly different DNA among all of these different caterpillars, and yet all of them produced adults that look basically like this. So this is a case where what was thought to be one species now appears to be 10 different, what we would call cryptic species, that have been revealed by these careful studies of its behavior and biology and by DNA studies. And so estimates as to how many species there actually are now range from about 2 million to more than 25 million. In particular, this okay. It's okay, no worries. This is a Smithsonian entomologist, Terry Irwin, who is deploying a canopy fogging device, so spraying insecticide into the canopy of tropical forests and then collecting all of the insects that rain down from the trees. And in 1982, he published a very influential paper which argued that there could be as many as 30 million arthropod species in the world, which was orders of magnitude higher than people had thought up until now. And that was based on observing about 1,200 species of beetle just in a single species of tree that he was fogging. And by estimating how many of those species of beetle were potentially associated with just a particular tree species, and then looking at how many tree species there are across the world, he was able to extrapolate these kind of extraordinarily high figures. And that really got people kind of interested in trying to figure out how many species there really might be. And so been various other approaches to working this out, and most people now agree between maybe 4 to 6 million, but we still don't really know, particularly with modern day DNA studies, which are now revealing a lot of cryptic species in cases which were thought to be well known. So what about our knowledge of the evolutionary history of insects? Well, clearly we need to understand the age at which the time scale at which major groups evolved, and so for that we're dependent on fossils. Insects are relatively poorly preserved in the fossil record, being small and relatively soft-bodied. Here are some nice examples of compressions and impressions of several insect species, and of course amber is another important way in which fossils can be preserved. This is actually a specimen of amber that I've been studying for the last year or so, which contains 3 butterfly individuals. There's one down here with its body and the wings, there's another here, there's its body and wings, and there's another one in here. And there's an antenna there and some legs here. And so despite spending many hours studying these butterflies under the microscope and various other ways, we've been unable to determine with a great degree of certainty what their relatives are. And of course, that's one of the main problems with the fossil record, is that these are just small fragments of the actual organism, and it can be very difficult. But this is a much better example of a butterfly preserved in amber. Here, as you can see, it's actually got color patterns on the wings, and in that case, the authors were able to reconstruct the color pattern of this butterfly and determine that it was a member of this genus Voltinia, and actually to determine its closest relatives, which are in Mexico. This is from the Caribbean, where clearly no members of this group now occur, and so there's clearly been a lot of extinction in that area. Interestingly, there are 5 known fossils, and they're all females. And we think the reason for that is because all of the relatives of this butterfly feed on epiphytic plants, such as orchids and bromeliads. This is a caterpillar of this species here, Formiola. And so the females are going to be looking for places to oviposit on these plants close to the trunks of trees, where they can become trapped in the resin, which eventually leads to them being fossilized in amber. And so this is a pretty cool story. But using, another way in which fossils of insects can be preserved is through their traces, such as these boreholes in wood, or the mines of insects within a leaf. And so these are important ways in which insects that otherwise are very soft-bodied and couldn't be preserved can still be detected in the fossil record. And so these fossils are extremely important in helping us to reconstruct the evolution of insects. And so again, as we saw already, this is an evolutionary tree of insects. Each one of these names, which you can't read, represents a particular insect species, representing its whole group. Each one of these gray points is a point at which one group diverged from another. And what we need to do is to calibrate the differences in DNA between these groups using some method. So our fossil evidence can be placed at different points throughout the tree, and we can use that to determine, for example, what kind of level of divergence between different species in terms of their DNA can tell us about when they diverged back in the history of the Earth. And so just to now run through then a quick history of insects over time. The larger group to which they belong, the arthropods, appeared down here about 540 million years ago at a time known as the Cambrian explosion, when most of the extant life forms that we see today all appeared rather suddenly in the fossil record. The first evidence of insects actually comes around 420 million years. This is a fossil known as Rhyniegnatha, and it's been interpreted as showing the mandibles, these little jagged things here, showing the mandibles of an insect, which have these two bases or condyles at the base of the mandibles. And so this is a feature of all but the very most primitive insect groups, and helps to place the origin of insects down here at around 420 million years. This point here, insect origin, is where we infer insects evolved based on that evolutionary tree with DNA sequences and fossil evidence. And so typically we would expect our fossil evidence to occur slightly later than when the group actually evolved. And importantly, this is not long after the origin of land plants, and as we'll talk about later, the relationships between insects and plants have been key for the evolution of both of these groups. So metamorphosis, the complete metamorphosis, appears around here, around 350 million years, around the time of these first major groups of plants, the seed plants, conifers and angiosperms. Winged insects are believed to have evolved around here based on DNA sequences, with the first fossils around here, around 320 million years. The first representatives of families that are still found today appear around 220 million years ago, at a time when most of the continents were joined together, and so many of these groups are now widespread across the whole of the Earth. And then we have this other major event, obviously, at the end of the Cretaceous, beginning of the Tertiary period, when a meteorite impact caused mass extinction across most of the planet in many groups. But shortly before that, we have this major radiation of flowering plants and the appearance of most modern insect families around 120 million years. And again, the synchrony between these two events has been interpreted as being a result of the very close relationship that insects and plants have, which we'll talk about in a minute. And then finally, we have to mention the period of time in which we are living today, the so-called Anthropocene. And I'm sure all of you have heard about alarming news of insect decline, in particular across temperate regions of the world. But the truth is that we really have virtually no idea what is going on in tropical regions, where the great majority of biodiversity occurs. And so although these are alarming stories from temperate areas, the full picture still remains to be filled out. But in any case, with the apparent decline of insects in at least in the regions of the world where we live, it's becoming increasingly important to think about how that is going to affect us. And so I'm going to talk a little bit now about the so-called services or ecosystem services that insects provide for us. And as you can see from this figure, which charts studies on this particular topic, this has only actually gained the attention of researchers in relatively recent years. These are papers focusing on, basically what's going to happen if we lose insects. And so this is now obviously an area of increasing interest. And I'm just going to talk about one paper from 2006, which highlighted 4 different kinds of services provided by insects, just as examples of the kinds of the services that insects provide. And they selected these simply because they were able to put some kind of dollar figure on the value of these services. And so the first of those is dung burial. And so back in 2004, there were about 100 million head of cattle in the United States producing vast amounts of solid waste. And in this case, insects, particularly the scarabaeoid beetles, are especially valuable in removing dung, burying it for their larvae, and decomposing it. And this has several beneficial outcomes, including improving the palatability of the grass, for example, where the dung is deposited, adding nitrogen back into the soil, and again improving the yield of the crops that these domesticated animals are feeding on, and then removing dung, which can be a source of pests and parasites. And so this is estimated to have a value of nearly $400 million per year in the USA alone. Pollination is obviously another major service that I think you're going to have a whole talk about this later on, so I'll just briefly mention that this was estimated to have a value of nearly $4 billion in the United States, and it's based just on the services of native insects, not domesticated insects, which pollinate the flowers of numerous important crops, and these are just some of them. Some of the examples down here, more than 40 different kinds of crop species. And so now this is estimated to be of hundreds of billions of dollars a year in value in terms of services provided worldwide. And so without these native insects, this would clearly be an enormous economic problem. Insects also provide important service as as pest control, as predators and parasitoids of other insects that damage crops, estimated at $4.5 billion a year in the United States. And then finally, one that perhaps most people don't think about, but as insects are also food for animals that are either hunted, such as wildfowl and fish, or subject of just observed by us for recreational purposes, in particular birds, but increasingly insects as well, and such as butterflies and moths and other groups of insects. And so it's estimated that about $50 billion a year is spent in the United States on kinds of recreational activities that are highly dependent on the presence of insects in natural ecosystems. And so again, strong reason for us to be interested in conserving these organisms. But of course, aside from these more practical kind of economic considerations, insects are obviously vitally important members of natural ecosystems and have very intricate lifestyles. And there's, from the perspective of a university and education and scientific knowledge, they have a huge amount that they can teach us, and have already been instrumental in teaching us about the natural world. And so I'm just going to talk about a few of those examples. One of the kind of classic areas of study has been on the role of insects as pollinators and how that has permitted the diversification of the flowering plants, which includes most of the plants that are of kind of value to us today, and that most of the diversity of plants, in fact, that we see in natural areas. And so because most angiosperms, most flowering plants, are pollinated by insects, the plants obviously offer these rewards to insects in the form of nectar and pollen. Insects respond by pollinating the plants, and that enables a much more efficient pollination, for example, than, say, wind dispersal. And so plants have been able to adapt to be more widely dispersed, which helps them to resist, for example, attack by pathogens, and to adapt to new kinds of habitats in areas where other kinds of mechanical dispersal of pollen is not feasible. And so this interaction between insects as pollinators of the flowering plants has been seen to be tremendously influential in allowing flowering plants to diversify to the extent that they have. Another major area of interaction between insects and plants is with insects as herbivores. And so plants have responded to being eaten in many cases by developing all kinds of chemical defenses. And so this is an example of chemical defense in milkweeds, and insects likewise have come up with numerous kinds of adaptations to overcome these defenses. And so those include, for example, cutting through veins and allowing this toxic latex to bleed out, or isolating areas of leaves that prevents the plant from mobilizing its resources to an area that the insect is now capable of eating. And so all of these sort of behavioral adaptations have allowed certain groups of insects to exploit these plants that are otherwise strongly protected against all other kinds of herbivores. And so one of the most kind of classic cases of an insect feeding on milkweeds and being assumed to be unpalatable is the monarch butterfly. And so this was regarded for many years as a butterfly that obtained the chemicals that protected it by feeding as caterpillars. This is a great quote by entomologist E.B. Ford, who collected a monarch butterfly in England in the 1940s, and was tempted to eat it to see whether it really was as unpalatable as everybody thought, but resisted the urge because monarchs are rare in England, and he decided to keep it for his collection. But one of the scientists who figured out the relationships between the chemicals in the plants and the palatability of the butterflies was Lincoln Brower, who was a professor here at UF back in the 1960s. And so he was fascinated in trying to prove that the toxicity or the unpalatability of the butterfly was really a result of the food that it fed on as a caterpillar. And the way he did this was through cabbages. And he had this ingenious idea that if he could breed a strain of monarch butterflies that fed on cabbage, he would be able to see whether it was the chemicals in the plant that were protecting the adult butterflies. And so the series of dedicated experiments introducing thousands of caterpillars to cabbages and having most of them die, and crossing and breeding the ones that survived and switching them back to their host plant, and various kind of ingenious methods, he succeeded in breeding a strain of monarch butterflies that fed as larvae on cabbages. And as a result of that, when he fed those adult butterflies to blue jays, he was able to show that these birds were quite happy to consume these butterflies. They were not protected in any way. But the same bird, when fed monarchs that have been reared on milkweeds, reacted in a much more unenthusiastic manner by vomiting, and he's throwing up here, and they'd scratch, wipe their bill and try to get rid of this unpleasant taste. And so this was a kind of classic series of experiments that helped to show how the chemicals in the plants were protecting these adult butterflies. So we have evidence of a very long-term a history of interactions between insects and plants in the fossil record, and in these circumstantial evidence of periods of explosive radiation in both of those groups coinciding across the history of time. And today, about 40% of all insects are herbivorous, and these are some of the major groups: the Lepidoptera, the moths and butterflies, the Hemiptera, or sort of aphids, cicadas, plant hoppers, etc., the Orthoptera, the grasshoppers and locusts, and then certain groups of beetles. And so these are some of the major herbivores that interact with plants. And the very close relationship between certain groups of insects and certain groups of plants led to the formulation of this very famous theory of coevolution by Ehrlich and Raven in 1964. And these are some of the groups that they identified as being classic cases of a very close relationship between a group of butterflies, such as the Troidine swallowtails and the Aristolochias, Ithamiine butterflies, these transparent butterflies, and Solanaceae, or Purine butterflies, and Caparidaceae and Brassicaceae. And in each of these cases, we have a group of insects which is almost exclusively the only group that can feed on a particular group of plants. And so the suggestion is that there's a constant sort of arms race between these two groups of organisms, with the plants developing new ways of deterring herbivores through their chemical or mechanical defenses, and then certain groups of insects being able to overcome those, and then providing a completely new and free resource on which they can radiate. And so they propose that this sort of series of interactions have been very important in the overall evolution of both insects and plants. And so this idea was tested in a study of beetles, which are obviously the most diverse group of organisms, about 50% of them being herbivorous. And in this case, they compared what are called sister groups of beetles, which is one group of, which are the two groups that have the same common ancestor and have therefore been around for the same period of time, where one group feeds on flowering plants and the other doesn't. And so they asked the question, do we see much higher diversity in the group that's on flowering plants than the one that isn't? And the answer is yes. In 5 different comparisons, the group that's on the flowering plants is always much more diverse than the group that isn't. And so they interpreted this as strong evidence that if you can switch to feeding on flowering plants, then it's going to greatly increase your chances of diversifying. So one of the other fascinating phenomena, which is a kind of result of these interactions between insects and plants, is that of mimicry. And so this is an area that I've been involved in research over a number of years. And it was a British naturalist, Henry Walter Bates, who first came up with this idea during his travels to the Amazon in the 1800s. And so one of the things that he observed as he moved up the Amazon River was remarkable kind of consistent changes in the wing patterns of butterflies. So these are 2 butterflies that he found together at this place, Fonteboa. And as he moved upstream, the wing patterns sort of changed completely, but they carried on resembling each other. And so he found this fascinating. This was one of his observations. The second observation was that a number of species of butterflies seem to be remarkably brightly colored and very slow flying. And why would that be? There are so many predators in tropical areas, so many species that have incredible camouflage. what enabled these kinds of butterflies to survive. His third observation was that in any particular group of butterflies, these are Ithamian butterflies, often transparent. These are period butterflies, which are usually white and yellow and very fast flying. There would occur occasional species like this. This is also a period butterfly, but it's very similar to this and very dissimilar in behavior and its appearance to its relatives over here. And so he was very interested in that. And so he formulated his now famous theory of what's now known as Batesian mimicry, suggesting that some species of butterflies are protected by some kind of chemicals, and that species that are not protected mimic them and have the same warning color pattern to deceive predators into thinking that they are going to be inedible. And at the same time, he also noticed that this idea of mimicry, or the evolution of color patterns towards a different kind of color pattern, could be a way in which new species could evolve. And he published this in 1862, and it was immediately seen by Darwin as a kind of classic example of how natural selection could lead to speciation. And so this was one of the very early examples that was seen as being very important in evolutionary biology. But Bates couldn't explain another very common observation, which is in groups of butterflies and other organisms that are all equally well protected, these groups also tend to be very similar. So this is a species of heliconine here, heliconine butterfly, and another one here, which are extremely similar and evidently mimicking each other, or apparently mimicking each other, and yet both of them are toxic to predators. And so this guy Muller suggested that these butterflies, even though both well protected, benefit by looking the same because a predator only has to remember one kind of warning color pattern. And so this is a completely different kind of mimicry. And Muller also produced one of the very first mathematical models to describe how this could be advantageous to an organism in developing these similar color patterns. So Bates saw mimicry and these changes in color patterns as important evidence of adaptation and a way in which we could study how organisms evolve and how speciation occurs through accumulation of small steps in terms of small steps of variation and natural selection. And so this is something that we've been involved in studying over a number of years, using mimicry as a way to kind of understand the sort of ecology of communities and understand how different species evolve and can coexist. And so we conducted a study in the Amazon area in eastern Ecuador, looking at communities of butterflies there. And as we would expect from Muller's theory, all of these butterflies, which are all equally well protected, have the same kinds of color patterns and are all found in the same area. But these aren't all of the Ithamian butterflies that are found in that forest. In fact, when we look at all of the species, about 60 of them, you can see that there is what appears to be a complete jumble of different kinds of wing color patterns. And given one's natural tendency to create some order, these can be organized into 8 rather distinct kinds of different color patterns, which we call mimicry rings. And so we have this apparent paradox. All of these butterflies are supposedly protected from predators. Why don't they all look the same? Why do they have these sort of multiple different kinds of color patterns? It's as if we decided to use red for a stoplight in one area and pink in another and blue in another, and you had to remember that there are all these different colors, all essentially meant the same thing. And so we focused on the predators of these butterflies, which are believed to be mostly birds that are driving these color pattern evolution. And we found that there are very different communities of butterflies found in different parts of the forest that are very close together. So down in the valley, we found predominantly this yellow group of butterflies and certain kinds of birds that were mainly found in the valley, whereas up on a ridgetop, a quite different group of butterflies, these orange and yellow ones, and different groups of birds. And these areas of the forest are separated by only a few hundred meters. And so we did an experiment where we glued a lot of rather poor, unfortunate butterflies to the ends of sticks and placed these out on the ground near mist nets in the hope of trapping the birds that were coming in to feed on them. And then we recorded how these butterflies were attacked by birds. And we found, I apologize for this confusing graph in the middle of the afternoon, but I'll try and explain it. So we found that butterflies were in general much more common in the valley overall. This yellow pattern was much more common than the orange pattern in the valley, but on the ridge, the orange pattern was much more common than the yellow one. But we also found that the yellow pattern in the valley is that was attacked much less frequently than the orange one, and the opposite up on the ridge. So essentially, in each of these areas, the birds are familiar with this yellow pattern and know that that's something they need to avoid. They're much less familiar with the orange pattern, and they're much more likely to attack that. And the opposite is true on the ridge. So we have this system where even within a couple of 100 meters within the forest, there's very strong differences in the likelihood that you will be attacked by a bird in a valley versus a ridgetop. So it's basically like saying, well, if you stray one block from where you live into the next block, you're likely to be in trouble. That's basically what these butterflies are experiencing. And why do they show these marked differences in habitat? It seems to be related to the areas where the host plants are growing, the plants that the caterpillars feed on, to the extent that we find that butterflies that feed on the same plant very often mimic each other. So these are two unrelated species. These are their caterpillars, which look quite different, but they're found on the same plant. And because their plant grows in the same area, there's a very strong selection for them to look the same. And here's another pair over here. Again, two different species of butterflies that are found on the same plant that look very similar. And here's a whole bunch of different pairs that are all found on the same kind of plant and look very similar. So, the kind of plant that you feed on has a very strong effect on the appearance of these butterflies. Not only that, but also on their overall behavior. So we notice that butterflies show these kinds of territorial displays where they're attracting mates, and where they choose to perform those displays is also dependent on where the plants that they feed on as caterpillars grow. So some species have territorial displays in the valleys, others on ridge tops, and that's determined by the areas where their plants grow. So this whole area of study just show that the lives of insects and the lives of plants are very closely intertwined and very intricate and related to the areas of the forest or the natural areas in where they live. And so the change in any one of these kinds of aspects of the life history can have important knock-on effects to all other aspects of their biology and behavior, etc. And so this is a case of what seems to be speciation, or a very recent case of speciation. These are a lot of highly variable color patterns, but in fact representing two species, one here and one here. Most of the individuals of this species look like that, and most of that species look like that. And they feed somewhat on the same kinds of plants. These are the different kinds of plants that the caterpillars feed on, but at least there's some kind of preference here for this species on that plant and this species on a couple of other plants here. And so, hopefully this is teaching us something about the ways in which species can diverge at a very early stage through adapting to different kinds of host plants, adapting with different kinds of color patterns, and potentially also different kinds of behavior, for example, the areas of the forest where they're seeking mates, etc. So aside from these insights into evolutionary biology, certain kinds of insects, and in particular butterflies, have been used in terms of conservation. And so this is a map of areas of diversity of these ithamine butterflies, a group that I study, which is showing areas which are believed to be important for conservation of these butterflies and potentially other groups of insects. And so red areas are areas that contain high numbers of species that occur in a very small distribution and are at high risk through loss of habitat. Blue areas are the same, except areas where there's a lot of intact habitat. And so by mapping the distributions of these butterflies, we can try to identify areas that are high priorities for conservation, both in terms of areas that need kind of immediate action now to reverse whatever kinds of activities are going on and destroying habitats, versus areas that have great potential as maybe natural areas or natural reserves for butterflies, but as well as butterflies, all other kinds of organisms, given that insects comprise such a high proportion of overall biodiversity. Insects, and in particular butterflies, were also one of the groups that was the first to illustrate the effects of climate change. So this is a paper in 1996, which showed how populations of this butterfly, Euphydrias editha, tended to go extinct at low latitudes and at low elevations, where the effects of warming climates were most severe. And so this was one of the earliest studies, insects being very sensitive organisms very closely related to aspects of their ecosystem, such as plants, but microclimate, which are easily affected. And obviously, with their short generation times, they respond very quickly to changes. These are some more recent studies that have used that have mapped the distribution of butterflies within the United Kingdom, and they show how different kinds of species are responding to climate change. So species that are very sedentary tend not to move into areas that have become newly habitable as a result of changes in climate, whereas species that are more mobile do tend to expand their ranges. And so over time, these butterflies have moved north into northern England as the climate has warmed, whereas these more sedentary butterflies have remained stranded in the south, unable to colonize new habitat patches. So as I mentioned earlier on, we have still very little knowledge about what's going on in the tropical areas, but we're using butterflies in Ecuador as a group to try to study trends in insect populations by working with rangers in several national parks. And so they are doing monthly monitoring studies and using butterflies which are relatively easy to identify. And we're hoping that over, if we can keep this program going for maybe 10 or 20 years, we can start to understand the trends that are going on in tropical insects. And so finally, I just wanted to mention the potential role of insects in education, and being easy to catch and rather charismatic. Insects are great for introducing kids to the idea of science and natural history. This is a bug camp that was organized by some of my colleagues at the Maguire Center. This is a course that I was recently involved in Ecuador, where we had about 30 very keen, mainly South American students who are interested in learning more about moths and butterflies. It's great. You can just go out with a sheet and a light at night, or with a net in the day, and catch and observe these organisms very easily and learn about science and natural history. I have a number of students who are doing research on butterflies in particular. I think this is a great way for students to get involved in research. It requires very little initial knowledge, and there's so much to be discovered that almost anybody is capable of finding really new results and publishable results within just a year or two. And this is an exhibit that we had over the summer that many of you may have attended, the Incredible Insects exhibit, which again is another great way to teach people about diversity and evolutionary biology. And then finally, as I mentioned earlier in the talk, the just sheer enjoyment of observing nature is something that I don't think we shouldn't take for granted. And although birds have gathered the lion's share of attention in that area, certainly the idea of observing insects has become increasingly popular. And so many of you probably know and use this iNaturalist online app for recording and sharing images. And so just a couple of years ago, there was what they call a City Nature Challenge, in which they encourage people living in cities all around the world to go out and take photographs and share the images of what they find and help to identify them and to record and better understand the diversity of organisms living in and around the places that we live. And so, I was very surprised to see that more than 600 people just in the area of this small town in eastern Ecuador had contributed observations of butterflies just over a period of a couple of weeks to this program. And so I think this is a great way also in which people can become more kind of knowledgeable and appreciative of the natural areas that are surrounding the places that they live. So thank you very much for your attention, and all the people who have helped in the research some of the research I've talked about, and I'm very happy to answer any questions.
Hello, you have questions?
I do have a couple of rather simple questions, and I know it was a fascinating talk, and I know it's probably impossible to generalize, but in terms of butterflies, you would think that because of the wing patterns, they identify one another for mating purposes by sight. And I wonder how far away they can be before they stop being able to identify themselves, their own species. The wing patterns are very complicated, and I wonder if you get farther than 1 foot or 1 meter, whatever it is, if they can no longer spot their own species. And my second question is, among the insects that are not social insects that live individually. I'm not talking about ants or termites or bees, but let's say the cockroach. What is the most durable of the insects, would you say? Would it be the cockroach, or is there some other kind of insect that's an individual liver that would be the most durable in terms of any factors you might want to include?
Okay, so the first question about the wing patterns, I think so many butterflies are just attracted to a particular color from quite a long way away, and so even morpho butterflies, for example, the big blue morpho butterflies, you can attract from 60, 70, 80 feet away just by flashing a piece of blue paper. They'll at least come to investigate. So I guess there's an initial kind of long range attraction to something that looks even vaguely appropriate, and the nearer they get, potentially they become more discriminating in terms of identifying whether that's an appropriate color or not. But still, you frequently see interactions between butterflies that are completely unrelated, but just look somewhat similar. So it's a bit of a mystery. They're pretty non-discriminating in terms of color pattern, and so we assume that there are other mechanisms that they use to identify whether they're going to mate or not, which could be pheromones, which could be some kind of close-up behavioral mechanism, which could even be eventually the structure of the genitalia when they try to mate. So again, that's very kind of poorly understood, but certainly they will respond to color pattern over a long distance, and then presumably these other kinds of mechanisms come into play as they get closer together. In terms of your second question, I really don't really have an answer. Your guess is probably as good as mine. I mean, some butterflies even can live up to 8, 9 months as adults, which seems pretty extraordinary for insects that you would think would be quite sort of frail. So I don't know. I mean, as you say, cockroaches are sort of famously durable and resilient, but I would guess there are other insects that are similar. So yeah, I don't know.
When you think about monarchs and their heroic trip flying from North America to the forests of Mexico.
Yeah. I mean, monarchs are a classic example as well.
Without stopping to reproduce, whereas when they're flying back north, they do hop along and reproduce along the way. So
Right.
It's one of those amazing events in nature. More questions? I'll take over on this side.
Referring back to the 10 different species of butterfly, because you could tell them from their immature forms. Is this displaying convergent evolution, and if so, what is the pressure?
So they're all closely related. The adult hasn't changed, but the caterpillars have changed, and so this is that's often the case that certain parts of the organism are under strong selection and others just aren't. For whatever reason, there's obviously not been much selection for the adult to change, but there has been for the caterpillars and the plants that they feed on. And we don't really know much about the significance of those color patterns that the caterpillars have. They might be involved in mimicry. There's some evidence for mimicry in caterpillars. There may be other species that feed on the same plants that they feed on that are toxic in some way, and so there's some selection for mimicry. But again, this wasn't really known at all or understood until the last couple of decades in this particular case. So as yet, nobody's really looked into that.
There was a question over here, and then I'll come back to you.
So much of this has to do with colors and patterns when you're talking about mimicry and other things. Is this complicated at all? Do male and female butterflies look different? And if they do, does that complicate all of this?
So in the butterflies that are unpalatable and toxic, they tend not to look different, and they tend to be similar on the underside and on the upper side. And I guess the rationale is that if you have a warning color pattern, you want it to be as simple and easy to remember as possible. And if you've got different patterns on the upper side and the underside, and the male and the female look different, then that's just complicating how much a predator has to remember in terms of what to avoid. Whereas other groups of butterflies are often very different on the underside, often camouflaged on the underside and maybe bright blue on the upper side, and the male will be blue and the female will be orange. And so there's often quite a lot of differences between the sexes in in butterflies that are not unpalatable. And so in terms of how they recognize one another, it's a very good question. The heliconius butterflies, I think I showed at the beginning, where there's a race at the top and a race at the bottom, geographic races. Those are so distinctive that you would think that color pattern, that there's no way that they would be able to mate because they look so different, and yet they do. So there's a lot of study in heliconius butterflies about how they use color pattern to recognize one another. And so even when the color patterns are quite different, there's still obviously some kind of there's some kind of attraction to a particular color pattern. And so yeah, it's extremely complicated, and there seem to be a lot of areas that are hard to explain. Species that are so similar to us that it's almost impossible to see a difference. How do they detect the differences between one another? And that kind of goes back to the question about are they using just the color patterns? Are they using are they using scent? Are they using some kind of behavioral differences? Another way in which they can kind of avoid interacting is through these sort of behavioral differences where they're active at different times of day or in different habitats. And so some butterflies that two species of butterfly that may look very similar perhaps have just occurring in different parts of the forest. Maybe one flies low down and the other is flying high up in the canopy, and so they just don't ever tend to meet one another. And so that kind of separation in space or time is another way that they can kind of avoid say hybridization events or attempted matings with a species that's not the correct species. So, but still, yeah, it's an area that needs a lot of work.
I was wondering, when you distinguish two species, do you need to see that the DNA is different? I mean, it seems that the similarities in appearance are so close, but you're able to say, well, these look just alike, but they're two different species. Does that depend upon that their DNA is different?
So, I mean, it depends. So there are kind of three different ways in which these butterfly and insect researchers can kind of discriminate between species. And so traditionally there was just the morphology, just the sort of appearance of the wing pattern or the wing venation or the genitalic structures is something that kind of appeared later on. So initially people just relied on what you could observe externally. And around the late 1800s, and they invented sort of stereo microscopes, people started to look at these internal structures like the genitalia, and that was a bit of a kind of revolution. Suddenly, people started to see differences in what, that weren't apparent just based on wing pattern. And the same kind of thing has happened again in the last 20 years or so with DNA sequences. But suddenly we've got a whole new way of looking at, trying to understand how many species there are in a sort of complex drawer of butterflies that all look a little bit variable, but we're not sure. So, but between those sort of three different kinds of evidence, like the wing pattern, the genitalia, and the DNA, we can, if all three of those coincide, we can be pretty sure that that's a distinct species, or even just two of them. But if you just have one kind of variation and the other two don't really show any variation, then we're usually pretty skeptical. And so there's been a lot of debate in recent years about whether differences just in a small piece of DNA between two kind of groups of organisms is good enough evidence that they're different species. And most people would probably say, no, you need some other kind of evidence, some morphological evidence or behavioral evidence or ecological evidence. But, typically we try to have multiple pieces of information, multiple kinds of data that are telling us the same thing before we would decide and make a decision.
Thank you. It was fun seeing you operating as a scientist and looking very much like you filled the role. I'd like to ask questions going back to the beginning. And that is, you showed us a fossil of a winged insect identified as maybe a dragonfly,
Right.
maybe not, from approximately 160, 170 million years ago. That's a pretty sophisticated insect already.
Right.
But what was there, what crawled out of the ocean to create the forerunner of insects, of land living insects?
Well, so those the sort of some of the primitive insects are things like the bristletails, the silverfish. That we had silverfish at the beginning, these sort of non-winged insects. So those are kind of primitive, more generic arthropod-like organisms that have 6 legs and are obviously on the way to becoming, the kind of insects that we know today, the sort of, which mostly are the winged insects, the pterygotes. And so I guess we assume that those early insects looked like that they were small and wingless and, probably mostly detritivores, mostly living in relatively sort of, dark, humid areas.
I read somewhere that termites are the predecessor species of many others, like ants and
So-
wasps.
So termites, as a saying, are now sort of known to be related to groups in cockroaches, like these Cryptocercidae.
Say that
So-
again?
The termites are a derived group of cockroaches.
Wow.
So they're actually embedded within cockroaches. And that's something that's only really become apparent with DNA sequencing in the last sort of 10, 15 years. So that was a bit of a surprise, I think, because they look so morphologically different. But, now that, we have very good evidence that that's the case.
I wonder what the stimulus was for that diversion, for that diversity, it's because it's so different from cockroaches to termites.
Right, so the group that I talked about, the Cryptocercus, is kind of seen as, potentially showing an intermediate stage where you've got a, cockroach that's become wingless and is living sort of inside rotting wood, and that's starting to show some of the characteristics that termites have, like this sort of caring for the young, and this sort of longer generation times, and that can potentially sort of then lead on to the development of a sort of social system. And so, I think with that's sort of now starting to be seen as a potential way in which the sort of social systems of termites could have evolved.
So can we become more sympathetic to cockroaches knowing that they care for their young? Ah,
Great talk. Appreciate it. Earlier, in response to another question, you sort of touched on behavioral aspects of cryptic species and how they maintained isolation by.
No, it's okay.
Can you hear?
Yeah.
And how they maintained isolation by habitat differences or where they were in a canopy and all that. It must be quite difficult to tease out these differences in behaviors whenever you have such a complex ecology. I see a terrier with the fogger, and everything that came out of that tree, you wouldn't know what the niches were for these insects.
Yeah.
Also, so maybe you could comment more on that, and also, is anyone looking at pheromones more specifically as ways that cryptic species maintain isolation?
Yeah, so I mean, the canopy fogging, for example, that's sort of the first stage of trying to understand, insect diversity. It's just how many species are there, the basic kind of work of a museum taxonomist, and so yeah, you're not getting any great information there other than those species are associated with that species of tree, for example, but we don't really know much else about their sort of lives or. And even in the case of butterflies, when I started working in Ecuador about 30 years ago, and there were probably at least 600 or 700 species of butterflies that weren't described at that time. And so the last few decades, we've been doing a lot of work describing those species. And now, at least in some groups, we've got to the point where you really don't, we can now identify them reliably without having to kill them and sequence them or whatever. And so that's the point where you then start to be able to move on to look at some of these other questions, because you can collect them, photograph them, let them go, and now we can start to see whether maybe one species is like abundant in the rainy season and the other's abundant in the dry season, because we've got data from throughout the year. Or you can, we now have DNA sequences for many of the adult butterflies, and so we can start to try to figure out what they're feeding on as caterpillars, and even if we can't rear the caterpillars through, we can sequence the caterpillars, and that tells us something about the plants that the caterpillars are feeding on. And so, once you get to a certain body of knowledge, you can then sort of move on to the next level of questions, which are these kinds of questions about their ecology and behavior and natural history. So at least in the case of beetles, it's such an exceptionally diverse, complicated group that I don't know to what extent that people are onto that kind of later level of questions. But at least in the case of butterflies, there are groups where we have a pretty good understanding of a lot of the species ecology. And they, what was the second question?
I know with ants and some other, and some economic Lepidoptera, pheromones play a big
Oh,
role
yes,
in
yes.
isolation. I wonder if anyone's looking at that in more feral populations of these Lepidoptera.
Yeah, it's, I think the answer is probably not yet really, at least with the majority of species. I'm sure some work's probably been done in Heliconius, but I'm not particularly familiar with it. But at least in the groups that I study, relatively little. In the Ithamine butterflies, there was an early study that suggested that butterflies were using their pheromones not only to attract members of the same species, but also members of other species that look like them. So to kind of increase the number of butterflies in one area that all have the same morning color pattern and provide more protection from predators, which was a pretty interesting result. But that's, I know some people who've tried to replicate that and not really been very successful, but that's again a potentially huge area of investigation.
Well, thank you very much. We are running over time, and we really appreciate your comments and the information that you provided with us. Thank you.
Thank you so much.